She stepped off the stagecoach into nothing. No husband waiting, no house in sight, just three bearded mountain men standing in the dust like a wall of silence, and 100 miles of wilderness between her and everything she had ever known. The letter had promised a home. The letter had promised respect. The letter had not mentioned that the tallest one had a scar that split his face like a river, or that the second one carried a knife and a grudge against the whole world, or that the youngest one would be the only reason she did not climb back on that coach and never look back. She was running from a powerful man in Chicago who believed he owned her. And if these three brothers ever found out who was coming for her, everything they were about to build together would burn. This is how that story begins. The stagecoach door swung open and three men stood in the dust like a wall of mountain and muscle in silence. The tallest one had a scar that ran from his left temple down to his jaw, a pale river cutting through sun-darkened skin. The one to his right stood with his arms crossed and his jaw set so tight it could have been carved from the same granite that made up the ridge behind him. The youngest leaned against the hitching post with the easy posture of a man watching the world decide what it wanted to be, but his eyes were sharp, reading everything. Rosalind Farnham stepped down into the Wyoming dust with one trunk, one secret she carried from Chicago, and one truth she was not ready to speak. She was running, and if these three men ever found out who she was running from, she would be back on that stagecoach before the sun touched the mountains. The letter had promised a home. The letter had promised respect. The letter had not said a single word about three bearded mountain men and 100 miles of wilderness between her and anything resembling the world she knew. If you are listening for the first time, go ahead and subscribe. I share new frontier stories every week, and drop a comment telling me where you are listening from tonight. I love seeing how far these tales travel. Now let me tell you how this story really began. 3 months before that stagecoach pulled into Elk Ridge, Wyoming territory in the autumn of 1874, Silas Drummond sat at the kitchen table in the cabin he had built with his own hands and stared at a piece of paper that felt heavier than any burden he had carried in his 35 years on this earth. The cabin smelled the way it always smelled: pine smoke and wood resin, and the faint iron tang of the cast iron stove that squatted in the corner like a black beast. The table was rough-hewn oak cut from a tree Silas had felled on the north slope 2 winters ago and shaped with an adze until it was flat enough to eat on. Above the stove hung 3 cast iron skillets and a Dutch oven black with years of seasoning. A shelf along the far wall held their supplies in careful order: flour, salt, dried beans. Strips of smoked venison hung from the ceiling joists like dark ribbons, curing slowly in the warmth that rose from the stove. The floor was pine plank worn smooth in paths between the stove and the table, and the door by years of heavy boots. 2 small bedrooms branched off the main room. Silas slept in one. His brothers Colton and Everett shared the other, sleeping on bunk beds made from rough timber and rope. Through the single window, the last light of a September afternoon painted the valley in gold and amber. Snow-capped peaks rose in the distance. Dark pines climbed the ridges. And somewhere below, the creek murmured its endless conversation with the stones, the only voice that ever broke the silence of this place at night. The advertisement sat before him: 2 hours of writing and crossing out and writing again. He read it one more time. 3 brothers. Mountain homestead. Seeking wife. Must be willing to work. Plain appearance preferred. No expectations of romance. He had crossed out that last line 4 times before leaving it, because it was the truth, even if the truth made him feel like a man standing at the edge of a cliff and looking down. The door banged open and Colton came in from the horse barn, his boots tracking mud across the floor, bringing with him the smell of horses and hay and the restless energy that followed Colton Drummond the way thunder follows lightning. He was 31 years old and built like something the mountains had made for the specific purpose of breaking things. He spotted the paper on the table. His eyes, the color of dark whiskey, went sharp. "You really going through with this?" It was not a question. Colton rarely asked questions. He made statements and waited to see if anyone had the courage to disagree. Behind him, Everett came through the door carrying a pot of stew. The smell filled the cabin instantly. Venison and wild onion and potato and sage. A meal Everett had conjured from almost nothing, because the youngest Drummond brother had hands that understood food the way Silas understood timber and Colton understood horses. Everett was 27, quieter than both his brothers, with eyes that saw things other people missed and a smile that could make a stranger feel like an old friend. He set the pot on the stove, glanced at the paper on the table, and said nothing. But his eyes said what his mouth would not. He knew Silas was lonely. He knew all three of them were. "Cannot make it through another winter with just the three of us," Silas said. His voice was low and even, the voice of a man who measured his words the way he measured timber. Twice before cutting, the ranch needs more hands. Cabin needs someone keeping meals and mending when all three of us are out from dawn to dark. Stock needs tending when winter locks everything down. Colton pulled out a chair, dropped into it, and stared at his brother. "You wrote plain appearance preferred." He said it flat like he was reading a verdict. Silas touched the scar. He did it without thinking, the way a man touches a wound that never fully healed. The scar ran from his left temple, down across his cheekbone and along the hard line of his jaw, a permanent reminder of the logging accident 7 years ago that had killed their father and nearly killed Silas. Half a ton of green timber coming down the mountain. The snap of the guide rope. The sound his father made when the logs hit. And then Silas, 28 years old, kneeling in pine needles and blood, holding his father's hand while the life drained out of him. The smell of fresh cut pine and iron. His father's voice barely a whisper. "Take care of your brothers." Then silence. The kind of silence that never really ends. Colton had been in town that day. 24 years old and drunk in the saloon, spending money they did not have on whiskey they did not need. He did not learn what happened until the next morning when Walt Brennan rode into town with the news. Colton had not forgiven himself. 7 years and counting. Everett had been 20, working in the cattle barn when he heard the crash. He ran through the trees. He was fast, but not fast enough. By the time he reached them, Silas was kneeling in the blood, and their father was gone. Everett carried that image like a stone in his chest. 3 brothers, 3 wounds, one day that broke them all in different places. "I'm being realistic," Silas said. Walt Brennan showed up the next morning, the way Walt always showed up, unannounced and opinionated, riding his gray mare up the trail with his hat pushed back and his mouth already working before he dismounted. Walt was their nearest neighbor, 5 miles south, a widower in his 60s with a ranch twice the size of theirs and a talent for saying the things nobody wanted to hear. He found the advertisement on the table and read it while drinking Everett's coffee. "You wrote plain appearance preferred," Walt said. "Why?" Silas touched the scar again. Walt set down his cup. "You are being a coward, all 3 of you." Colton hides inside his anger. Everett hides inside his smile. And you hide behind that scar like it is a wall between you and the rest of the world. Silas mailed the advertisement anyway. The response came 6 weeks later, written in careful handwriting that spoke of education and deliberate thought. Silas read it at the table while Colton leaned against the doorframe with his arms crossed, and Everett sat on the edge of his bunk, listening. "Dear Mr. Drummond, I am writing in response to your advertisement. I am 23 years old, in good health and willing to work. I understand the frontier demands strength, and I believe I can meet those demands. I ask only for honesty and respect. If these terms are acceptable, I can arrive by stagecoach in late September. Respectfully, R. Farnham." Nothing about appearance, nothing about expectations, nothing about what she was leaving behind, or why a young woman of 23 would answer an advertisement from 3 strangers 1,000 miles away. Colton picked up the letter, read it, and dropped it on the table. "She is running from something." Everett picked it up, read it again, and said quietly, "Or she is looking for something. Same as us." Silas wrote back the same day. The waiting was worse than the loneliness. Every morning he woke wondering if he had made a terrible mistake. Every night he lay in the dark, listening to the wind against the cabin walls and imagining a woman arriving, taking one look at his face, and refusing to step off the coach. Colton sharpened his hunting knife every evening, his steel singing against the wet stone in long, slow strokes. That was what Colton did when he was worried. Everett cooked, more food than 3 men could eat, pies and stews and bread that filled the cabin with warmth and the smell of something like hope. That was what Everett did when the tension got thick enough to taste. But nothing had prepared any of them for the moment that stagecoach pulled into Elk Ridge on a bright October afternoon in 1874. But what stepped off that stagecoach was something none of them expected, and it would change everything. The driver called the stop, and The town gathered the way frontier towns always gather when something breaks the rhythm of ordinary days. Elk Ridge was not much. A general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, a small church that doubled as a schoolhouse. Maybe 40 souls on a good day, and most of those souls were standing in the street now, watching the stagecoach settle in its dust cloud like a ship coming to anchor. Silas stood at the back of the small crowd with his hat pulled low. Colton flanked him on the right arms, crossed jaw set, every line of his body communicating the same message it always communicated. Try something. See what happens. Everett stood on the left weight on one hip, thumbs hooked in his belt, relaxed as a summer afternoon. But his eyes were moving, reading faces, reading the stagecoach, reading the air itself for whatever was about to happen. The door opened, and Rosalind Farnham stepped into their lives like a storm dressed in navy blue. She was not plain. She was not practical in the way Silas had imagined. She was the kind of beautiful that made every man in the crowd straighten his spine and every woman stop whatever she was doing to look. Her hair was honey blonde, catching the October light in waves that fell past her shoulders, partially pinned up in a modest style with soft strands escaping around her face and temples. Her traveling dress was fitted in elegant navy blue fabric with subtle texture, high quality even under the dust of 1,000 miles. A small cameo brooch sat at her throat, lace details at the collar and cuffs. She was small, 5 feet and 3 inches of something that looked delicate, but stood with her shoulders back and her chin lifted in a way that suggested she had been lifting that chin against the world for a very long time. Silas saw threat. A woman like that would take one look at his scarred face, his struggling ranch, his empty life, and she would be back on that stagecoach before sunset. His hand moved to his scar without conscious thought. Colton saw trouble, expensive clothes, soft hands that had never touched barbed wire or split wood, skin that had never weathered a Wyoming winter. She would not last the week. Everett saw what his brothers missed, the way her hands were clasped tight in front of her body, not graceful, controlled. The fine line between her brows that spoke of real worry, the slight tension in her jaw. But also this, chin lifted, shoulders straight despite the trembling she was trying to hide. Everett thought she is scared to death, but she is walking forward anyway. That is not weakness. Her eyes, cornflower blue and large, and framed by dark lashes, swept the crowd and found them. Something in her expression shifted. Recognition, maybe, or decision. She walked straight toward them, her strides steady despite traveling shoes that were clearly not made for Wyoming gravel. Mr. Drummond, her voice was educated, Eastern, completely wrong for this place. A voice that belonged in a Chicago parlor or a Boston drawing room, not a dusty frontier town where the nearest neighbor was 5 miles away and the nearest doctor was 3 days' ride. Silas swallowed. Yes, I am Rosalind Farnham. The crowd had gone quiet, every ear tuned to this impossible moment. 3 mountain men and a woman who looked like she had stepped out of a painting. She extended her hand. Colton did not take it. He just nodded once, his whiskey-colored eyes measuring her the way he measured an unbroken horse, deciding how much fight was in her. Everett stepped forward and took her hand with a warmth that came as natural to him as breathing. Welcome to Elk Ridge, Miss Farnham. How was the journey? She looked at Everett and something in her face softened. Just a fraction. Long, dusty. But I am here. Walt Brennan pushed through the crowd, his weathered face creased with concern. Miss Farnham, maybe you should consider. I should go with my future husbands. Rosa interrupted him, her voice polite, but absolute in a way that left no room for argument. That is why I am here. The word husband sent a shock through all 3 Drummond brothers. Colton's arms tightened across his chest. Silas felt the ground shift under his boots. Everett's smile stayed steady, but his eyes sharpened. They were not married. Not yet. Maybe not ever once she saw what she had walked into. My trunk, please, she said to the stagecoach driver. And just like that, Rosalind Farnham took the first step into a life that none of them were ready for. The ride out to the ranch took the better part of an hour, and it happened in a silence that felt like standing at the edge of something very high and looking down. Rosa sat beside Silas on the wagon seat, her posture straight, despite the rough road her eyes taking in everything. The empty prairie stretching to the horizon, the mountains rising blue and white against the sky. The scattered cattle on land that was more brown than green. The smell of sage was thick in the cooling air, sharp and clean, and nothing like anything she had ever known. Colton rode his horse on the right side of the wagon, close enough to watch, but far enough to signal his position on the matter. Guarded, evaluating. Everett rode on the left, and every few minutes he would point something out to Rosa, a red-tailed hawk circling above the ridgeline, the creek where they drew water, an ancient pine tree that had been struck by lightning so many times it stood like a dark skeleton against the sky. Everett called it the old man, small gestures. But Rosa noticed. At least one of these three brothers treated her like a person instead of a problem to be solved. When the ranch came into view, Silas felt the full weight of what she was seeing. The cabin was solid. He had built it himself log by log, and it was square and tight and would hold against anything Wyoming could throw at it. But it was small, simple, built for survival, not for beauty. The horse barn stood to the left, sturdy but unremarkable. The cattle barn to the right, larger, with a roof that sagged on the south side where the support timber was starting to show its age. Beyond that, the corral, the well, the outhouse, and all around the mountains rising like the walls of a cathedral that had no ceiling but the sky. "It is not much," Silas said, his voice rough with something that might have been apology. Colton swung down from his horse and tied it to the rail. His voice carried challenge aimed directly at Rosa. "It is what we have." Everett was gentler. "But it is warm in winter. I promise you that." Rosa stepped down from the wagon without waiting for help. She stood in the fading light and looked at the cabin, the barn, the mountains, the sky. Then she said something that none of them expected. "It is yours. That makes it mine now, too." She walked to the cabin door like she owned the place. Inside, she moved through the space with quick efficiency, her blue eyes cataloging everything. The cast iron stove, the rough table, the shelves of supplies, the two-bedroom doors, the smell of wood smoke and pine resin and venison that permeated every surface. She touched the table Silas had made, ran her fingers along the grain, and turned to face all three of them. "I need to tell you something." And Silas stood with his arms crossed. Colton leaned against the door frame, blocking the exit. Whether that was conscious or instinct was hard to say. Everett sat on the edge of the table, his legs swinging slightly, but his eyes were sharp and still. "I was not completely honest in my letter," Rosa said. Silas felt his heart sink. Here it was. The moment she would reveal this was all a mistake. "I am not plain. I am not from poverty or desperation in the way you might have assumed." "Then why are you here?" Colton asked it straight, his voice hard, not cruel, but not warm. "Because in Chicago, my family arranged a marriage to a man named Edmund Hargrove. He is 55 years old, owns factories across 3 states, and believes that women are property to be acquired and controlled." Rosa's voice stayed level, but something fierce burned beneath the surface, a heat that Silas recognized, because he had seen it in campfires that looked calm on top but were white-hot underneath. "I refused. My father, Gideon Farnham, locked me in my room for 2 weeks. When I finally escaped, I used money I had hidden to travel west under a different name." Silence fell on the cabin like a physical weight. Silas and Colton exchanged a look. Everett did not look at his brothers. He looked at Rosa, and what Silas saw in his youngest brother's expression was not surprise. It was confirmation of something Everett had already sensed. "So you lied," Colton said. Flat. The word hung in the air between them. "I omitted. I never claimed to be plain. I never promised I was running from nothing." Rosa met Colton's eyes directly and did not flinch. Silas watched this small woman stand her ground against a man who could break fence posts with his bare hands, and something shifted in his chest. "But I did not lie about the important things. I am willing to work. I do want honesty and respect. And your family will come looking for you," Silas said. "Probably. The man you were supposed to marry. We'll send people to find me." "Yes." Colton pushed off the doorframe and started pacing. His energy filled the small cabin like a storm building inside a box. "She is trouble, Silas. Rich trouble. The kind that can buy this whole territory and everyone in it." Everett spoke from the table, his voice calm and clear. "If we send her away, where does she go? Back to the 55-year-old man who thinks women are property." "That is not our problem," Colton shot back. "It is if she is standing in our kitchen." The room went quiet again. Rosa stood perfectly still, her hands clasped in front of her, her chin lifted. Watching the three brothers decide her fate, Silas saw the fear in her eyes. But he also saw something else. The absolute refusal to let that fear make her beg. "You sleep in Colton and Everett's room tonight," Silas said finally. "The three of us sleep out here. We decide in the morning." Rosa looked at him, then at Colton, who had stopped pacing, then at Everett, who gave her a small nod. And for the first time since stepping off that stagecoach, she smiled. It was small, almost invisible, but it was there. "All right," she said. She took her small traveling bag and disappeared into the bedroom. The door closed softly behind her. That night, the three Drummond brothers lay in the main room in the dark. Silas on the floor near the stove, Colton on the bench with a blanket that was too short for his frame, Everett curled in quilts near the dying fire. "She is running, Silas. We are inviting trouble into this house." Colton's voice was a low growl in the darkness. "I know. Rich trouble. The kind with lawyers and hired men." "I know." Everett spoke from near the fire, his voice barely above a whisper. "But did you see the way she looked at this place? Not with horror. She looked at it like she was already figuring out how to make it work, how to turn it into something." "That is exactly what worries me," Colton said. "Or it is exactly what we need." Silence stretched between them. The fire popped. The wind pressed against the cabin walls. Finally, Silas spoke into the dark. "If she stays, people will come looking. Rich people, powerful people." "So we let her go?" Everett asked. "We do not let anyone go or keep anyone. We give her a choice." Silas sat up in the darkness. That is the one thing her family never did. The morning came gray and cold, the first real bite of October air pushing through the gaps in the cabin walls. Silas woke to the smell of coffee. He sat up from his blanket on the floor, disoriented, and found Rosa standing at the stove, fully dressed, her hair pinned up in a practical style that bore no resemblance to the elegant arrangement from yesterday. She had found the coffee tin and the pot without asking. The table was clean. The fire was stoked. She moved through the kitchen with the quiet efficiency of someone who had decided something during the night and was not going to waste time discussing it. Everett was already at the table, cradling a tin cup, talking quietly with Rosa about the soil composition around the ranch, how deep the topsoil went, whether the creek bottom had good clay for sealing, the kind of conversation that sounded like small talk, but was actually the youngest Drummond brother doing what he did best, building a bridge. Colton stood in the doorway with his own cup, silent, watching. His face said he had not decided yet, but the coffee was good, and Colton Drummond was honest enough to drink it. "About yesterday," Silas started. "We do not have to decide everything today," Rosa said, setting a cup of coffee before him. "But I meant what I said. I want to stay. I want to make this work." Silas wrapped his hands around the cup. The warmth seeped into fingers that were permanently roughened from years of axe work and fence mending and all the thousand labors that held a mountain ranch together. He looked at this woman sitting at his table drinking coffee from his tin cups, and for the first time in 7 years, the cabin did not feel empty. "If you really want to stay," he said slowly, "you need to know what you are walking into. This ranch barely turns a profit. Winters are brutal. The work never stops. And the three of us," he gestured at his face at Colton's scarred forearms, where old rope burns had left pale tracks at Everett, who just smiled sadly. "We are not the kind of men women look at twice. You are wrong about that." Rosa's voice was matter-of-fact, carrying the same tone she might use to correct an error in arithmetic. "Scars just mean you survived something that could have killed you. I respect that more than a pretty face." Her blue eyes swept all three of them, equal, honest, unflinching. "Show me the ranch. Show me what needs to be done. We can figure out the rest as we go." Silas led her outside, half expecting her elegant composure to crack when confronted with the reality of what a mountain ranch demanded from the people who lived on it. It did not crack. She looked at the cattle scattered across the brown autumn pasture. She looked at the fences that needed mending, the posts leaning at angles that spoke of years of hard weather and deferred maintenance. She looked at the cattle barn with its sagging south roof and the horse barn where Colton's 3 horses stood watching them with dark, curious eyes. She looked at all of it and she just nodded. "Where do we start?" Silas showed her how to fences first. How to test a post by gripping it and pushing. How to tighten barbed wire with the fencing pool bow, careful of the barbs that could open a hand to the bone if you were not paying attention. How to recognize a post that had gone soft with rot and needed replacing. He spoke in short, practical sentences, and Rosa listened with an attention that reminded him of how Everett listened, taking everything in, processing it, filing it away. His hands guided hers on the hammer. The first time their fingers touched, both of them pulled back like they had been burned. Silas turned away and looked at the mountains, his jaw tight, his hand rising halfway to his face before he caught himself and shoved it into his pocket instead. Rosa pretended she had not noticed. Colton assigned her the hard work, testing her. 2 buckets of water from the creek, a quarter-mile walk each way, the buckets heavy enough to make your shoulders burn. Split a pile of kindling for the stove. Sweep out the horse stalls. He stood at a distance and watched with his arms crossed, waiting for the complaint that would prove what he already believed. That she was soft, that she would not last. Rosa did it all, slowly, clumsily, but without a single word of complaint. When she finished, Colton walked over, took the water buckets from her hands, and carried them to the cabin without a word. He did not look at her, he did not explain. But Everett saw it from the kitchen window, and he smiled. Everett and Rosa cooked dinner that evening. She stood beside him at the stove while he showed her how to adjust the heat on the cast iron by opening and closing the air vents underneath quarter turns that made the difference between bread that rose golden and bread that burned black on the bottom. How to make sourdough in the Dutch oven, the heavy lid holding the heat in so the crust came out cracking and perfect. How to season venison with salt and dried sage until the whole cabin smelled like something worth coming home to. Through the window, Silas and Colton worked on the corral gate. In the fading light, their silhouettes moving in the rhythm of men who had worked together so long they no longer needed words. They ate in comfortable silence. 4 people around a table built for 2. Everett praised Rosa's first attempt at cornbread. Colton ate 2 portions and said nothing, which from Colton was very nearly a compliment. Silas watched Rosa clear the table and felt that dangerous warmth spreading through his chest again. The warmth that terrified him because it had a name. Hope. The pattern held for 4 days. Each morning Rosa rose early, made coffee, and worked beside the brothers. Each day she learned faster, adapted quicker, complained never. And each evening the distance between the 4 of them shrank in ways that frightened all of them for different reasons. Silas retreated. Afraid of hope, Colton tested, assigning harder tasks, watching for the breaking point that never came. Everett opened, talking with Rosa about the land, the weather, the seasons, telling stories from their boyhood on this ranch. Small stories, funny ones. The time Colton tried to ride a bull calf and ended up in the creek. The time Silas built a bookshelf that collapsed at 3 in the morning and scared them all half to death. Everett built bridges the way other men built fences, 1 plank at a time, patient and sure. On the 4th day, Walt rode out to check on them. He found Rosa on the roof of the cattle barn, hammering new shingles into place, while Silas worked below, and Colton repaired the barn door, and Everett cooked lunch inside. Sweet mercy, Walt said. She is actually doing it. Doing what Silas said, not looking up, staying, working, being here. She is stronger than she looks, Colton said. The first voluntary statement he had made about Rosa since her arrival. Walt noticed. Silas noticed. Even Colton seemed surprised he had said it. That is not strength, Walt said. That is determination. He looked at Silas directly. Are you boys going to marry her or not? I do not know if that is fair to her. Fair. Walt's patience broke open like a dam. She traveled 1,000 miles. She is on your barn roof in October. She reads your ranch books at night. What more does she have to do to prove she wants this? And the 3 of you, when are you going to accept that you deserve something good in your lives? That evening, the tension at dinner was thick enough to spread on bread. Rosa set down her fork. Everett set down his. He looked at Silas with the expression he wore when he was done waiting for his older brother to do the obvious thing. Ask her, Everett said simply. Silas looked at Rosa across the table. The firelight caught her honey blonde hair and the blue of her eyes and the small, determined set of her jaw. Do you want to get married? Yet, Rosa set down her fork. Yes, just like that. We have been living like a family for 4 days already. Making it legal just means no one can challenge my right to be here. Is that the only reason, Colton asked? His voice was strange. Lower than usual, almost soft. Rosa looked at him, then at Silas, then at Everett. No, but it is the reason that matters most right now. The other reasons can wait until you are ready to hear them. They rode into Elk Ridge the next morning. The circuit judge happened to be passing through a fortunate coincidence that Walt Brennan may or may not have arranged. The ceremony took less than 10 minutes. No flowers, no music, no guests except Walt, who stood with his hat off and his eyes suspiciously bright. Just Silas's rough voice promising to honor and protect. Rosa's steady voice promising the same. Colton and Everett standing as witnesses. Colton rigid as a fence post, his jaw so tight the muscles stood out like cords. Everett smiling but with wet eyes that he did not bother to hide. When the judge pronounced them married, Silas felt the ground shift beneath his feet, as if the whole world had tilted 2 degrees and nothing would ever sit quite level again. Rosa Perriam. Now, Rosa Drummond just smiled. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, but something had changed. They were not strangers playing at an arrangement. They were something else now. Something that had a legal name, but whose real shape was still forming, still uncertain, still terrifying in its possibility. That night, Rosa stood in the doorway of the bedroom she had been using. Silas was spreading his blanket on the floor. Colton was already on the bench. Everett was banking the fire. "This is your home," Rosa said softly. "Stop sleeping on the floor of it." Colton opened one eye and looked at her, but said nothing. Silas swallowed hard. "I do not want you to feel pressured into anything. We are married. You sleep in the bedroom. I will use the other room." She paused and something gentle moved across her features like sunlight through clouds. "When everything is ready, we will figure the rest out." She closed the door, and Silas lay in his own bedroom for the first time in 4 days, knowing that Rosa lay on the other side of a thin timber wall. Colton and Everett settled into their room, and for the first time since their father died 7 years ago, the cabin felt different. Not empty, not quiet in the way that loneliness makes a place quiet, but full of something Silas was only beginning to understand. Rosa was not afraid of him, was not repulsed by his scars or his silence or his damaged belief in his own worth. She had chosen this life, chosen them, all 3 of them. And that was more terrifying than anything Silas Drummond had ever faced, because now he had something to lose. The mountain wind pressed against the cabin walls. The fire settled in the stove. And somewhere in the darkness, each of them lay awake thinking about the woman who had stepped off a stagecoach and changed the shape of their world. But what none of them knew, not Silas with his careful plans, not Colton with his sharp eyes, not Everett with his gift for reading people, was that a man in Chicago had already sent someone to find her. And that man was not the kind who accepted the word no. The hardest part was still ahead, and it would test all 4 of them in ways none of them could imagine. The days that followed the wedding settled into a rhythm that felt as natural and as fragile as the first ice forming on the creek. Each morning, Rosa woke before dawn, started the coffee, stoked the stove, and had the cabin warm by the time the brothers came stamping in from their early chores with cold, reddened hands and breath that hung in clouds. Everett taught her the stove, how to coax the cast-iron beast into giving even heat by adjusting the air vents underneath quarter turns that made the difference between bread that rose golden and bread that burned black on the bottom. How to season the Dutch oven with lard until the surface was slick as glass. How to make biscuits from flour and lard and buttermilk, working the dough with quick hands so the butter stayed cold and the layers came out flaky and light. Rosa learned fast. By the 3rd morning, her biscuits were better than Everett's, and when Colton reached for a 4th without comment, Everett caught Rosa's eye across the stove and winked. Silas taught her the fences. They worked side by side in the cold October morning's breath, clouding between them, his large calloused hands, showing her small ones how to grip the fencing tool, how to twist the wire tight, without letting the barbs catch skin. The work was slow and hard, and Rosa's hands blistered within hours. She did not mention it. Silas noticed anyway. He noticed everything about her now, the way she tucked a strand of honey blonde hair behind her ear when she was concentrating, the way she bit her lower lip when the wire would not cooperate, the way she stood back and studied a fence line, the way a general studies a battlefield, looking for the weak point, the place where effort would matter most. Colton watched all of this from a distance that was not quite far enough to be indifferent and not quite close enough to be involved. The Wild One had his own way of testing Rosa. He assigned the hard jobs. Hauling water from the creek in 2 heavy buckets, the path downhill slick with the morning frost, the path back up a burning climb that made your legs shake and your shoulders scream. Splitting kindling with a hatchet that was heavier than it looked. Mucking out the horse stalls where 3 horses produced more mess in a day than a woman from Chicago could probably imagine. Colton stood with his arms crossed and his face hard and waited for the complaint. It never came. Rosa worked slowly, clumsily, her body learning movements that were foreign to everything she had known. But she did not stop, and she did not complain, and she did not ask for mercy. On the 4th evening, Colton came into the cabin and found Rosa at the table with paper and pencil. Her face set in the focused intensity that meant she was calculating something. He pulled out a chair and sat across from her, which was itself remarkable because Colton Drummond did not sit across from people. He sat at the end of tables or leaned against walls or stood in doorways. Sitting face to face was for Colton an act of unusual engagement. "What are you doing?" Rosa did not look up. "The south roof beam is rotting from the core. I found it yesterday when Silas and I were checking the barn. If we sell 3 head and spring at market price and use that money for timber, we can rebuild the barn roof and still have enough for winter feed, assuming market prices hold." "Everything is an assumption," Colton said. "Then we plan for the assumptions and adjust when reality arrives." She pushed the paper toward him. "What do you think?" Colton read the numbers, his brow furrowed. She had calculated feed costs per head through winter, projected calf survival rates based on the quality of their breeding stock, estimated timber costs including transport from the mill in Cheyenne, and built in a 10% contingency for price fluctuation. "You figured in transport costs," he said. "And contingency, where did you learn this?" "My father owned textile mills in Chicago. Before he decided women could not understand business, he used to let me sit in his office and watch him work. I read ledgers before I learned poetry. Then he changed his mind. Then I grew old enough to marry. And suddenly everything I had learned became an unwomanly interest in men's affairs." Colton looked at her across the table, and for the first time since she arrived, his expression held no suspicion, no challenge, no guarded distance. It held respect. Pure, unguarded, surprised respect from a man who did not give it easily. "It is tight," he said, "but it could work." 6 days after the wedding, Silas woke before dawn to find half the cattle missing. The north pasture fence had gone down and the night post snapped clean by something that might have been wind, or might have been age, or might have been the simple accumulated weight of too many things going wrong at once. He dressed in the dark. Colton was already at the barn saddling his horse, his face set in the grim expression of a man who had been expecting bad news and was almost relieved it had finally arrived. Everett appeared with his boots already laced. The cattle had split into 2 groups. Silas tracked the main herd north toward the creek. Colton went south alone, riding hard into the gray morning light. Rosa was pulling on her riding boots before anyone could tell her to stay. "You sure you can handle this?" Silas asked. "I learned to ride when I was 6. I will manage." She looked at Everett. "Ride with me." They went east together. Rosa on the smaller of Colton's horses, Everett beside her on his bay mare. 4 hours later, Silas got the main herd moving back and found Rosa waiting at the fence line with her group already secured. She was covered in dust. Her hair had come loose and hung in wild strands around her face. There was a cut on her forearm where brush had caught her and a tear in her sleeve that showed skin underneath. But she was smiling. 11 heads, she said. They did not want to cooperate. But I convinced them. Colton had returned before them. He stood by the barn watching Rosa dismount, and on his face Silas saw something he had never expected to see from his middle brother. Not suspicion, not challenge, something closer to recognition. The look of a man watching someone pass a test he had not realized he was giving. "You are bleeding," Silas said. Rosa glanced at the cut like she had forgotten it was there. "Caught it on some brush. It is nothing. It needs cleaning." After we fixed the fence, they worked side by side until noon, resetting posts and restringing wire, and when they finally headed back to the cabin, Silas could not stop looking at her. The woman who had stepped off a stagecoach in silken elegance was covered in dirt and sweat and dried blood, and she looked more real than anyone he had ever known. That evening, while Silas cleaned and bandaged Rosa's arm at the table, Colton stood nearby, not hovering, just present. He handed Silas the clean cloth without being asked. He set a cup of water beside Rosa's elbow. Small acts, almost invisible, But Everett noticed from across the room, and the look on his face said he understood exactly what was happening. The Wild One was beginning to let down his guard. Not all the way, maybe never all the way, but enough. That night, the third night after the wedding, Rosa heard something outside the cabin while the others slept. She went to the window and looked out at the cattle barn. Colton sat alone on a log behind the barn, his back to the cabin, his broad shoulders hunched forward, and he was shaking. Not from the cold. Rosalind Farnham Drummond had grown up around men who hid their pain behind closed doors and expensive whiskey. She recognized what she was seeing. Colton Drummond was crying, silent, violent, the private grief of a man who believed no one in the world was watching. She stepped back from the window without making a sound. She never mentioned it. But the next morning and every morning after, she poured Colton's coffee first, set it at his place before he came through the door. A small gesture, almost invisible. Colton noticed. He did not understand why, but something in his chest loosened by a fraction every morning when that cup was waiting. On the fifth day, Rosa tried to milk the cow for the first time. The cow kicked the bucket. Milk went everywhere. Rosa sat on the barn floor covered in warm milk, her hair plastered to her face, and for a moment the silence in the barn was absolute. Then Everett laughed. Not at her, with her. The sound was warm and genuine and so unexpected in a place that had known mostly silence and work and grief that it seemed to change the temperature of the air itself. Colton stood in the barn doorway. His face tightened. Then the corner of his mouth twitched, just barely. A tremor of something that might have been amusement if Colton Drummond ever allowed himself such a thing. Silas handed Rosa a towel, and for the first time his eyes met hers and held. He did not look away. He did not retreat behind his defenses the way he had every day before this one. He just looked at her, milk dripping from her chin, sitting in a puddle of failure, and something in his expression softened into something that was not yet tenderness, but was no longer distance. I think the cow does not like me, Rosa said. The cow does not like anyone, Everett replied, still grinning. You are fitting in perfectly. On the seventh night, rain came. Hard and cold, an October rain that hit the mountains like a fist and warned of worse to come. The four of them were trapped inside the cabin, the fire popping in the stove, the wind pressing against the log walls. Everett made venison stew. The smell filled every corner of the small space. Wild game and potato and onion, foraged from the creek bank, and dried sage from the bundle that hung near the stove. They sat around the table, and for the first time since Rosa's arrival, they talked. Really talked. Not about fences or feed costs or barn repairs, about themselves. Rosa told them about her mother, dead when Rosa was 12, a quiet woman with kind hands who smelled like lavender and who used to read aloud in the evenings, her voice making the stories feel like rooms you could step into. When she died, the last soft thing in that house died with her. Gideon Farnham looked at his daughter and saw not a child who needed comfort, but an asset to be maintained and eventually traded. Not a daughter, a thing. Silas told them about the accident. His voice dropped low and rough, each word heavy as a stone being placed with deliberate care. The logging camp, the guide rope snapping, the sound of half a ton of green timber breaking free. His father's hand in his growing colder. The whisper, take care of your brothers. The silence after. The smell of pine sap and blood that he could still summon in his nostrils on bad nights 7 years later. Colton did not speak. He stood up from the table and walked out the door and stood in the rain. His silhouette was visible through the window, a dark shape against the darker night rain, streaming down his shoulders and his bowed head. Everett watched his brother, then said quietly to Rosa, he was not there the day it happened. He was in town. By the time he got back, Father was already gone. He has not forgiven himself. Rosa looked at Colton's shape in the rain. None of you need forgiveness, she said. You just need to stop punishing yourselves. The wind pressed against the cabin walls. The fire popped. And in that silence, something shifted between the four of them that could never shift back. The next morning, the rain had stopped, but the ground was slick with mud and cold water. Rosa went to the well to draw water, and her foot slipped on the wet slope. She went down hard, her balance gone, the bucket clanging against the stones. A hand caught her arm before she hit the ground. Large, calloused hot against her skin through the thin sleeve. Colton. He had been riding past on his way to check the fence line. He had dismounted and caught her in one smooth motion as natural as breathing. His hand closed around her forearm with a grip that was strong but not rough. He held her upright for 1 second. 2. 1 second too long. Then he let go and stepped back. Careful, he said. The first word Colton Drummond had spoken to Rosa that was not a warning or a challenge or a test. Just that. Careful. As if she were something worth being careful with. Thank you, Rosa said. Colton was already turning away, swinging back onto his horse with the fluid grace of a man who had been riding since before he could walk. But Rosa saw his ears go red above his collar, and she understood something about the wild one that his brothers might not have seen. His anger was not cruelty, it was armor. And underneath the armor was a man who felt things so deeply that the only way he knew to survive was to pretend he felt nothing at all. That evening, Rosa sat by the fire mending a tear in one of Silas's work shirts. Silas sat across from her, pretending to read a battered almanac, but watching her hands instead. Small hands moving quick and sure, the firelight catching the fine golden hairs on her wrists. When she finished and held up the shirt, their fingers brushed as he took it from her. Both of them froze. Neither pulled away. The moment stretched thin and bright as wire in sunlight. You do not have to hide the scar, Rosa said quietly. It just means you survived something that should have killed you. No one had ever spoken about it like it was evidence of strength instead of damage. Silas set down the almanac. He looked at her in the firelight and did not touch his scar, and did not look away, and did not do any of the things he had done every day for 7 years when someone's eyes lingered on the wrong side of his face. He just looked at her, and she looked back, and something between them settled into a shape that was beginning to feel permanent. But the piece they were building was about to break, because there was a man asking questions in town, and he had not come alone. 2 days later, Walt rode out to the ranch at a pace that said the news was not good. He pulled up in front of the cabin, his horse lathered, his face grim. There is a man in town asking questions, wants to know about a woman who came west on the September stagecoach. Description, where she went, who she is with. Says he represents the Farnham family of Chicago. The blood in Silas's veins turned to ice water. Colton straightened from where he had been working on the corral gate, his hand moving to the knife on his belt without conscious thought. Everett set down the bucket he was carrying and went very still. Belongs to Rosa, said from the doorway. Her voice was flat and dangerous. That is exactly how my father would phrase it. Someone who belongs to a family. She had been listening. Did he give a name? Said he was representing the Farnham family interest, Walt replied. Pinkerton agent. My father always uses Pinkertons. Silas spoke first, his voice low and absolute. No one is taking you anywhere. Colton spoke second, his hand still on his knife. Not while I am breathing. Everett spoke third, quieter but with eyes like flint. We need a plan, not just anger. The Pinkerton agent arrived at the ranch 3 days later. He was exactly what Rosa had described. Professional, cold, absolutely certain of his authority. He rode up alone, well-dressed, well-armed, and dismounted with the practiced ease of a man who had done this work many times before. The 3 Drummond brothers stood before the cabin in a line. Silas in the center, the steady one, his voice low and final. Colton on the right, the wild one, his hand on his knife, his energy radiating danger like heat from a forge. Everett on the left, the quiet one, the calmest of the 3, but with eyes that missed nothing and promised nothing good for anyone who threatened what was his. Rosa stepped out behind them. Mrs. Drummond, she said clearly, my name is Rosalind Drummond. My well-being is excellent. And you can tell my father and Edmund Hargrove that I am a married woman and I am staying exactly where I am. The agent's eyes moved from Rosa to the 3 men standing between him and her. He calculated. 3 against 1, mountains at their back. No witnesses except the empty sky. Silas spoke and his voice cut the air like a blade. A man keeps his word, and my word is this. My wife stays. You leave. Now. Colton added one word. Today. Everett smiled. It was a smile that had nothing to do with warmth and everything to do with warning. The agent remounted his horse. He looked at them one more time with an expression that said, this conversation was far from over. Then he rode away toward Elk Ridge, and the dust swallowed him. Rosa's hand found Silas's in the silence that followed. Her fingers were cold. His were rough. They stood together, watching the place where the rider had disappeared, and Silas felt the weight of what was coming settle onto his shoulders like a yoke. That was only the beginning, Rosa said quietly. I know. They will send more. Lawyers, maybe worse. Let them come. Rosa looked up at him, and in her blue eyes, Silas saw something he had not expected. Not fear, trust, complete and absolute, given once and not easily taken back. But what she had hidden in the lining of her trunk, the letter she had stolen from her father's desk before she fled Chicago, the letter that described her in the language a man would use to describe livestock, that letter was going to change everything. And the hardest winter any of them had ever faced was still ahead. The peace lasted 5 days. Silas was mending the paddock gate when he saw 3 riders coming up the valley road, moving with a deliberate purpose that made every instinct he had scream danger. They were not local. Everything about them said money and eastern cities, from the cut of their coats to the way they sat their horses like men who had learned to ride at expensive academies rather than on mountain trails. Rosa had been on the barn roof replacing the last of the damaged shingles when the riders appeared. She climbed down without hurrying, walked across the yard with a hammer still in her hand, and stood beside Silas with soot on her sleeves and sawdust in her hair. She did not look like a woman who had lost her mind. She looked like a woman who had found exactly where she belonged. Marcus Kane dismounted first. He was 45 years old with silver threading through dark hair and eyes that assessed everything like a man calculating what it would cost to buy or destroy. He ignored the 3 Drummond brothers entirely and spoke directly to Rosa. Mrs. Farnham, I am legal counsel for Edmund Hargrove. We need to speak. It is Mrs. Drummond. Rosa's voice could have cut glass. And we can speak right here. My husband stays. Kane's expression tightened, but he continued. Mr. Hargrove has been patient. His patience has limits. He sent me to make one final offer. Return to Chicago voluntarily, and he will arrange a quiet annulment. No scandal, no consequences. He glanced at Silas the way a man glances at furniture he is considering removing from a room. Mr. Hargrove is even prepared to compensate Mr. Drummond for his trouble. The casual dismissal in those words hit all 3 brothers like a slap. But what came next was worse. Kane pulled papers from his coat. These are affidavits from 3 physicians in Chicago stating that you were mentally unstable when you left the city. They suggest you were not capable of making legal decisions. He read from the document, his voice smooth as oil. You fled your family in the middle of the night, traveled alone across the country, married a stranger you had never met. A judge might find that evidence of impaired judgment. Rosa's hand went ice cold in Silas's grip, but her voice did not waver. That is a lie. Silas spoke, his voice harder than he intended. A judge might also find it evidence of a woman escaping an abusive situation. Colton stepped forward, his voice low and dangerous, his hand resting on the knife at his belt. And 3 men standing here would very much like to know which doctors signed that filthy paper. Everett added calmly, maybe a judge would also be interested in how much money it costs to buy a doctor's signature in Chicago. One of Kane's hired men spoke up, his voice carrying a lazy threat. We could just take her now, 3 against 3. Who is going to stop us? Colton drew his knife. The blade caught the October sunlight and threw it back in a bright, sharp line. I will stop you, he said, and every word was a promise. Silas put his hand on his revolver. Everett did not move, but his eyes said everything that needed saying. Kane raised his hand and silenced his companion. That will not be necessary. He looked at all of them with an expression that mixed contempt with calculation. You have 3 days to reconsider. After that, the legal proceedings begin. And I promise you this will get very ugly for everyone involved. They rode away. But the look in Kane's eyes as he turned his horse stayed with Silas long after the dust settled. That man did not accept defeat. He waited for opportunities. Kane returned before the 3 days were up, but he did not come with hired men this time. He came with a territorial judge, 6 armed guards, and documents declaring Rosa mentally incompetent. Half the town of Elk Ridge gathered in the street, sensing something that would be talked about for years. Silas and Rosa stood together in the center of the street. Colton and Everett flanked them. Walt and Henry Cross and 6 other ranchers stood behind them in a loose half circle. Della Cartwright, the widowed schoolteacher who had known the territorial governor for 20 years and who had once fled an arranged marriage herself, stood at the front of the crowd holding papers of her own. Mrs. Drummond, the judge said, "I have reviewed the evidence presented by Mr. Kane. I am here to determine if your marriage was entered into under sound mind." "It was," Rosa said clearly. "The medical affidavits suggest otherwise. The medical affidavits were purchased by my father to control me." "They are lies." Rosa stepped forward, her voice ringing across the street. "My father wanted me to marry Edmund Hargrove. When I refused, he had me examined by doctors he paid to find me unstable. When that did not work, he locked me in my room for 2 weeks. I escaped and came west to marry a man who saw me as a person and not as property." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Della Cartwright stepped forward with letters from the territorial governor recommending the marriage stand unless the husband wished to contest it. All eyes turned to Silas. "Mr. Drummond," the judge said, "do you believe your wife was of sound mind when she married you?" "Yes." "Do you wish to annul the marriage?" "No, I keep my word." The crowd erupted in applause and argument. Kane's face went dark with fury, but the judge closed his book. "The marriage stands. This court has no grounds for annulment. Mr. Hargrove has no legal standing in this territory. The matter is closed." Kane mounted his horse, but Silas saw something in his eyes that made his blood freeze. This was not over. That evening, the four of them sat on the porch and watched the sun go down behind the mountains. Nobody spoke for a long time. Then Everett said, "We won today." Silas shook his head slowly. "We survived today. That is not the same as winning." Rosa leaned against his shoulder. "It is enough for now." But Silas could not shake the cold feeling in his gut. Men like Kane did not lose gracefully, they lost strategically. And the next move, whatever it was, would not come through a courtroom. He was right. 2 days later, Silas was checking the fence line in the south pasture when he saw the smoke. Not campfire smoke, not chimney smoke. Thick black smoke rolling up from the direction of the cattle barn. He ran. His boots pounded the frozen ground and his heart hammered against his ribs. And when he crested the rise and saw clearly, his worst fear confirmed itself. Fire consumed the south wall of the barn, spreading fast toward the hay stored inside. Rosa was already there with buckets, her face streaked with soot. Everett worked beside her, hauling water from the well in a desperate relay. Colton had pulled the horses out and was now beating at the flames with a wet blanket, his face twisted with effort and rage. "Horses are out," Rosa shouted. "The tack room is gone." "Forget the tack room. Stop it from reaching the house." Walt arrived with 3 other ranchers, and together they managed to save half the structure. But half was gone, burned to black ruin and ash, and the acrid smell of everything they could not afford to lose. Colton stood before the smoking remains with his hands burned and blistered, and the rage of 7 years finally breaking through every wall he had built to contain it. He drove his fist into the charred wall of the barn. Again. Blood ran from his knuckles. Again. Everett ran to interact around him and wrapped his arms around his brother from behind, holding the wild one steady with the calm strength that was Everett's deepest gift. "Enough, Colton. Enough." Rosa stood beside Silas, her face blackened with soot. She was not crying. Her eyes were hard. "They burned our barn," she said. The first time she had used that word. Silas looked at her. This woman who had stepped off a stagecoach in silk and lace and now stood covered in ash and dirt, calling this broken place ours, and he felt something shift in his chest that would never shift back. "Winter always ends," he said quietly. "We will get through this." Kane rode into town 2 days later and found Silas outside the general store buying rope and nails. "Mr. Drummond, a word." Silas wanted to walk past, but Kane stepped into his path. "This does not have to be complicated. Mr. Hargrove is prepared to offer you $5,000 to agree to the annulment." "No, 10,000. The number made Silas's head spin. With that money, he could rebuild the barn, buy new stock, secure the ranch for a decade. "No, 15,000. Final offer." Kane's eyes were steady and cold. "That woman does not love you. She is using you to escape her obligations. You have no idea what you are dealing with. Once the novelty of playing frontier wife wears off, she will leave you for someone more suitable." The words hit exactly where Kane intended them, straight into the deepest fear Silas carried. He pushed past Kane without answering, but the words followed him all the way home like wolves tracking a wounded animal. That night, Silas lay in the dark beside Rosa. They had been sharing the bedroom since a week after the wedding, since the evening Rosa had stood in the doorway and told him to stop sleeping on the floor of his own home. The door had closed softly behind them that night. When morning came, everything between them had changed. But now in the darkness, with Cain's words circling in his head, Silas could not stop thinking. "You are quieter than usual," Rosa said softly. "Just thinking about what Cain offered you." Silas went still. "How did you know?" "Walt told me. I am guessing he went high. 15,000. Rosa was silent for a long moment. "That is a lot of money, enough to save the ranch, buy new stock, fix everything that is broken." "Yes." She rolled to face him in the dark, her hand finding his. "Do you want to take it?" The question hung between them, honest and terrible. "Part of me does," Silas admitted. "The part that is terrified you will leave anyway. The part that thinks I am a fool for turning down that much money for a woman who might wake up one day and realize she made a mistake. And the other part knows that if I took that money, I would spend the rest of my life wondering what we could have been. I would wake up every morning in this empty house and remember the woman who made it feel like home. I would look at everything that money bought and know it was not worth what I lost." Rosa pressed her face against his chest. "I am not going to leave you, Silas. You say that now. I say it because it is true." Her voice was fierce in the darkness. "I did not travel 1,000 miles to play pretend. I married you because when I looked at you, I saw a man who was honest and kind and strong in ways that have nothing to do with money or power. And I fell in love with that man. Even if we lose everything, we will not lose everything. We will have each other. That is not nothing. A man keeps his word, and I am keeping mine." Silas pulled her close. She fit against him like something that had always been missing from the shape of his life. "I am scared," she whispered. "Me too. But I am not leaving. Neither am I." The next morning, Cain filed papers to have Silas arrested for threatening him with a firearm on his own property. 6 witnesses who would swear to it. The territorial marshal was riding in that afternoon. The trap was perfect. If Silas stayed, he would be arrested. If he ran, it would prove the charges. Either way, Rosa would be left alone and vulnerable. But Cain had underestimated the people of Elk Ridge. Henry Cross arrived at the ranch with 6 other ranchers before noon. "We heard what is happening," Henry said without preamble. "Figured you might need some witnesses to your marriage and your character." "Legal-like." Della Cartwright rode out behind them with a letter from the territorial governor and a look on her face that said she had been waiting 30 years for a fight like this one. Rosa stood in the cabin with Silas and Colton and Everett, and the weight of every option pressing down on them like a sky made of stone. And then she spoke with the steady voice of a woman who had spent her whole life watching powerful men maneuver and who understood exactly how the game was played. "There is one option," she said. "I go to Chicago voluntarily. I face Edmund Hargrove and my father in federal court. I take the letter I stole from my father's desk before I left. The letter where he describes me in the language a man uses to describe livestock. Good health, pleasing appearance, capable of bearing children. I read that letter to a federal judge, and I let the court decide what kind of men they are." Silas said no. His voice was raw and absolute. Colton said she was out of her mind the first time he and Silas had agreed on anything in years. Everett was quiet for a long time, his eyes moving between Rosa and his brothers. Then he spoke, and his voice was thin but clear. "She is right, not because we cannot protect her here, but because she needs to fight this herself. If we do not let her do that, we are no different from her father." Colton stared at Everett. For the first time in their lives, the wild one saw that his youngest brother was not a boy anymore. Silas pulled Rosa aside. The others stayed near the door, not listening but not going far. His hands, the hands that could split firewood all day without trembling, shook as he reached for hers. "I love you," he said, simple and absolute. The words came out the way Silas did everything, measured, certain, final. "I loved you when you climbed on the barn roof, when you chased down cattle alone in country that could kill an experienced rider, when you stood before that Pinkerton agent and did not flinch. And I love you now, even though loving you might cost me everything else." Rosa cried for the first time since arriving in Wyoming. The tears came without sound, sliding down her soot-stained face, and she did not try to stop them. I love you too. All of you. This whole family. She looked at Colton, who had turned away, his shoulders rigid, his jaw working like a man trying to hold back a river with nothing but willpower. You too, Colton. Even though you do not want to hear it. Colton did not turn around, but his fist clenched at his side, not in anger, in something that hurt worse than anger had ever hurt. Everett stepped forward and hugged Rosa with the easy warmth that was his nature. Come back to us. His voice cracked on the last word, and he did not try to fix it. Silas cupped her face in his hands. His rough thumbs traced the line of her jaw, wiping away tears and soot together. He kissed her, gentle and brief, the taste of coffee and mountain wind, his jaw rough against her skin. Then he pulled back and looked at her with everything he had spent 35 years learning to hide. You belong here. This is your home. I know. That is why I have to go protect it. The stagecoach left at noon. Half the town watched Rosa board. Kane stood in the crowd with a triumphant smile. Mrs. Farnham, glad you have come to your senses. Mrs. Drummond, and I have only realized that some battles have to be fought on the enemy's ground. She climbed into the coach without looking back. Because if she looked at the three Drummond brothers standing in the dust with their hearts breaking, she would never be able to leave. Colton put his hand on Silas's shoulder. The first time he had touched his older brother since the day their father died. The weight of that hand said everything 7 years of silence had not. Everett stood on the other side, tears running openly down his face, not bothering to wipe them away. She will come back, he said. You do not know that. I know her. That is enough. 23 days passed without a word, the longest days any of them had ever lived through. Silas worked the ranch like a man possessed, driving himself from before dawn until after dark, chopping wood until his hands went numb, mending fences that did not need mending, digging post holes in ground that was already freezing. Anything to keep his mind from circling back to the same questions. Was she safe? Had they found a way to keep her? Was he ever going to see her again? Colton disappeared into the mountains for days at a time, hunting what did not need hunting, riding where there was no reason to ride. He came back each time with empty hands and red eyes and said nothing to anyone. The sound of his knife on the wet stone filled the evenings with a high, thin singing that sounded like grief. Everett held everything together. He cooked, he cleaned, he mended what could be mended and made lists of what could not. He fed the cattle and checked the fences and kept the fire burning and did all the 100 small things that keep a household from falling apart when the people inside it are already falling. But every evening he set 4 places at the table, 4 tin cups, 4 plates, 4 forks, and then he would stand there for a moment, looking at the 4th place before quietly putting it away again. On the 23rd day, Walt galloped up the trail with a telegram in his hand and a grin on his face that took 10 years off his weathered features. Silas's hands shook as he opened the paper. Trial concluded, evidence presented, federal judge ruled in my favor, restraining order issued against Father and Hargrove. Coming home. Wait for me, love to all. Rosa. Silas read it 3 times before the words actually registered. He handed it to Colton. Colton read it once very slowly, then he walked to the cattle barn and did not come back for 20 minutes. When he did, his eyes were swollen and red, and if anyone had been foolish enough to mention it, Colton Drummond would have denied it to his grave. Everett sat on the porch step, holding the paper against his chest and crying without shame or apology. Winter always ends, he whispered to no one in particular. Winter always ends. Silas saddled his horse before anyone could argue. Colton was right behind him. Everett was right behind Colton. 3 brothers riding hard toward Elk Ridge, not a word spoken between them, because there were no words for what they were feeling, and all 3 of them knew it. The afternoon stagecoach pulled into Elk Ridge right on time. The door opened. Rosa stepped down into the Wyoming dust, looking tired and travel-worn, her dress wrinkled from days on the road, her hair escaping its pins, dark circles under her eyes. She was the most beautiful thing Silas Drummond had ever seen. Their eyes met across the street. Rosa's face crumbled with relief and joy and love, foam tangled together into something that had no name in any language Silas knew. He crossed the distance between them in 5 strides and pulled her into his arms and held her so tight she probably could not breathe, but neither of them cared. You came back. I promised I would. Colton stood behind them. rigid, red-eyed, his hands hanging at his sides like he did not know what to do with them. Rosa reached for him past Silas's shoulder. Colton looked at her hand. Then he took it and held it brief and hard and real. His jaw trembled once, and then he locked it down the way he locked down everything. Everett did not wait for an invitation. He wrapped his arms around Rosa from the side and pressed his face against her hair and said, "Do not ever be gone that long again." And for once, his voice carried no warmth and no humor. Just need, raw and honest and completely unguarded. They rode home together. Rosa pressed against Silas on the wagon seat, her hand on his arm, her head against his shoulder. Colton rode close on the right, closer than he had ever ridden before. Everett on the left, stealing glances at Rosa every few seconds, as if confirming she was really there. When the cabin came into view, Rosa saw the half-rebuilt barn and the new fence posts and the addition the brothers had started on the cabin itself. A new room, small but solid, with a window that faced east toward the sunrise. Everett had built it. For her. That night around the fire, Rosa told them everything. She had gone to her father's house first. Gideon Farnham stood behind his oak desk in his Chicago studies, surrounded by the wealth he had built on the labor of others, and looked at his daughter as if she were a ledger entry that had been filed in the wrong column. Rosa stood in the doorway and for the first time in her life did not let him speak first. The federal courtroom came next. Rosa stood before a judge and described every year of control, every locked door, every doctor summoned to declare her unfit because she had the audacity to say no. The judge was an older man with 4 daughters of his own, and he listened in a silence that filled the room like pressure before a storm. And then Edmund Hargrove walked in, 55 years old, silver hair, cold eyes that looked at Rosa the way a man looks at a horse that has thrown him. He spoke about family duty and the obligation of marriage contracts and the mental stability of young women who flee their responsibilities. Rosa let him finish. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out the letter her father had written to Hargrove before she fled. The letter that traded a daughter for a business contract, that described Rosalind Farnham in the language a man would use to describe livestock he was selling at auction. Good health, pleasing appearance, capable of bearing children. She read it aloud. Every word. The courtroom went silent. Hargrove went white. The judge read the letter twice. "My father disowned me," Rosa said, her voice steady in the cabin firelight, Silas's hand warm around hers. "Cut me off completely. I have no claim to the family money or the family name." Colton growled low in his chest. Everett closed his eyes. Silas held her hand tight enough to feel her pulse beating against his palm. "I do not care about the money. I never did. What I care about is being free, being able to choose my own life. And I choose this." She looked at all 3 of them, her blue eyes moving from face to face. "I choose all of you. This is home." The winter that followed was the hardest any of them had ever faced. But for the first time in 7 years, they did not face it alone. The first snow came early, 3 weeks after Rosa's return. Half the barn gone meant half the shelter for the animals, half the stored hay, half the buffer between them and the brutal Wyoming cold. They built temporary shelters against the remaining barn walls, lean-tos made from rough timber and canvas. Silas and Colton cut wood and hauled stone, while Rosa planned the placement, and Everett kept everyone fed and warm. Walt and Henry Cross showed up the next morning with lumber and extra hands. "Heard you might need some help," Walt said. "We cannot afford to pay you," Silas replied. "Who asked for payment?" Henry interrupted. "She is one of us now. We take care of our own." A 3-day blizzard hit in November. Winds so fierce they could not leave the cabin for more than a few minutes at a time. The 4 of them huddled around the stove, rationing firewood and food, and the silence that comes when there is nowhere to go and nothing to do but be with each other. And in that silence, they finally told each other everything. Colton spoke at last. His voice was low and ragged, and each word seemed to cost him something he could never get back. The day their father died. The saloon in Elk Ridge, the whiskey that tasted like freedom at the time and like poison ever since. The ride home when Walt came in with the news, Colton still half drunk, the world spinning around him. Reaching the logging site, kneeling beside their father, taking a hand that was already cold and stiff and understanding in that moment that he would never be warm again. "I should have been there," Colton said. The words came out like they had been trapped behind his teeth for 7 years. Rosa placed her hand on Colton's forearm, small hand on scarred skin, the first deliberate touch between them. He did not pull away. "You are here now," she said softly. "You protect this family every day. That is not penance, that is love." Colton looked down at her hand on his arm, his jaw clenched so tight the muscles stood out. His eyes glistened in the firelight. He nodded once, just once, more than Colton Drummond had ever given anyone. Everett was next. He told them what he had never told anyone, that he had always felt like the spare brother, the one who was not needed. Silas could build anything, Colton could break anything, and Everett could cook a meal and tell a joke and make people feel comfortable. And what good was any of that when the world required building and breaking and fighting? Rosa looked at him with those cornflower blue eyes that saw everything. "Everett, you are the reason I stayed." That first day on the wagon, Silas was silent and Colton was terrifying. "But you smiled at me. You pointed out the hawk and the creek and that old lightning-struck pine tree. You made me feel like a person instead of a problem to be solved." She paused and her voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. "You are the glue that holds this family together. Without you, there is no family, just three people living in the same cabin." Everett's smile trembled, but it was radiant. The kind of smile that a man gives when someone has finally seen him, really seen him. Not the cheerful one, not the easy one, the one who was holding everything together while quietly falling apart. Silas looked at all three of them, his wife, his brothers, the people he would die for without hesitation and live for with everything he had. And for the first time in 7 years, the cabin did not feel like a place where he was merely surviving. It felt like home. "Built this with our own hands," he said quietly, "stronger together than apart." The blizzard broke on the fourth morning. They emerged to find 2 feet of snow, and one of the lean toes collapsed. But the main barn had held, and when Silas counted the cattle, he found only 3 missing. Could have been worse. Could have been much worse. Spring came like a pardon. The snow melted. The creek swelled with runoff until it roared instead of murmured. Green appeared on the brown hills in patches that grew larger every day. And Rosa, standing on the porch in the morning light with a cup of coffee in her calloused hands, looked out at the land and said it is time. They held a proper wedding ceremony before the cabin on a Sunday morning in April. A traveling preacher who had ridden 2 days to get there, Walt standing with his hat off, Henry Cross and 6 other ranchers in their best clothes, Della Cartwright in a blue dress she had not worn in 20 years. The whole small, fierce community of Elk Ridge gathered in the yard of the Drummond Ranch and watched as Silas took Rosa's hands in his and said the only vow that mattered to him. "I keep my word." Rosa smiled through tears that caught the spring sunlight and turned to silver on her cheeks. "And I keep mine." Colton and Everett stood beside their brother, Colton rigid and formal in a clean shirt that Everett had pressed that morning, Everett grinning through wet eyes that he did not bother to hide. The door closed softly behind Silas and Rosa that evening. Outside, the last snow of winter melted off the cabin roof and ran down in silver streams that caught the final light of the day. When morning came, the world was new. Rosa presented a 5-year business plan to the bank in Elk Ridge the following week. She had worked on it all winter, filling pages with careful numbers and projections that showed exactly how the Drummond Ranch could grow from a struggling homestead into something real and lasting. Feed cost per head, projected calf survival rates, market price trends for Wyoming beef, timber costs for barn reconstruction, revenue projections that climbed year over year in a steady line that even the most skeptical banker could not ignore. Colton rode along to the bank ostensibly to help carry supplies, but actually to stand behind Rosa's chair, looking dangerous enough to discourage anyone from treating his sister-in-law with condescension. Everett brought fresh baked bread for the bank manager, a strategic decision that Rosa had suggested and that Everett had executed with the skill of a man who understood that the way to a favorable loan decision sometimes runs through a man's stomach. The loan was approved. 10 head of prime breeding stock arrived from Colorado in March. When Silas introduced them to the existing herd, Rosa stood beside him with dirt under her fingernails and pride in her eyes, and she said, "This is really happening." Summer brought expansion. The herd grew. The breeding stock produced strong calves. Colton broke horses and sold them at prices that surprised even him. Everett began selling bread and preserves at the Elk Ridge General Store, a small income that no one had expected, but that Rosa had calculated into her 5-year plan from the beginning. Autumn brought news. Della Cartwright rode out to the ranch with a letter from Chicago. Gideon Farnham was dead. Heart attack. 3 weeks prior. 3 weeks. Rosa sat on the porch with Silas beside her, Colton, leaning against the post with his arms crossed, Everett, bringing coffee the way Everett always brought coffee without being asked, and exactly when it was needed. Relieved, Rosa said quietly, sad. Angry that I am sad when he never deserved it. She took a breath, but mostly relieved. He cannot hurt me anymore. Hargrove married someone else, Colton said. His voice was flat, but his eyes were not. A senator's daughter, someone who will not fight back. There was pity in Rosa's voice when she answered, and Silas understood it. She had escaped, but how many other women had not? I could have been her, she said softly, but I am not. I am here with you, building a life I chose. That is what matters. In October, exactly 1 year after Rosa had first stepped off that stagecoach into the Wyoming dust, Silas woke to find her pale and trembling, gripping the edge of the table for balance. He had her back in bed before she could argue, and the doctor was on his way before she could tell him it was probably nothing. 3 Drummond brothers paced the porch while the doctor examined Rosa inside. Silas like a caged animal wearing a path in the boards. Colton sharpening his knife, the whetstone singing its high, thin song. Everett boiling water and laying out clean cloths and doing everything useful he could think of, because doing useful things was the only way Everett knew to survive moments when the world might be about to end. The door opened. The doctor stepped out. Congratulations, Mr. Drummond. Your wife is expecting. The word did not make sense at first. Expecting. A baby. Their baby. Silas looked past the doctor to where Rosa lay in bed, and she was crying and smiling at the same time, her hand on her stomach, her blue eyes bright with something that was not fear, but wonder. Colton smiled, a real smile. The first genuine, unguarded, full-faced smile that had crossed Colton Drummond's features since the day their father died 7 years ago. Wide and warm and completely honest. I will build the cradle, he said. Oak, Everett was already crying. I will teach the baby to cook before it can walk. Mercy Drummond was born in late May of 1876 during a spring rainstorm that washed the whole world clean. Labor lasted 14 hours. Silas held Rosa's hand through every minute of it, his face white, his grip steady, terrified and awed and more present than he had ever been in his life. Colton paced the porch until the boards creaked. Everett stayed in the kitchen, boiling water and preparing clean cloths and baking bread, because it was the only thing his hands could do that did not involve falling apart. When the baby's first cry rang through the cabin, thin and fierce and outraged at the world, all 3 Drummond brothers went still. Silas looked at his daughter, small and red and perfect, with her mother's blue eyes and her father's stubborn jaw, and something inside him shifted permanently, a door opening onto a room he had not known existed, filled with a love so large and so immediate that it made everything that had come before it seem like practice. She is beautiful, Rosa whispered, exhausted and glowing. She has your eyes, Silas said. Colton carved the cradle from oak. He worked on it for 3 weeks, every joint precise, every surface sanded smooth, the wood oiled until it gleamed like honey in the firelight. He set it beside their bed without a word, but Silas saw him brush his fingers along the rim as he walked past, a touch so light it was almost imaginary. A small gesture, an enormous meaning. They named her Mercy, because mercy was what had brought 4 strangers together and made them a family. Because mercy was what Rosa had shown when she looked at 3 broken men and saw not damage but possibility. Because the word itself sounded like something worth building a life around. Della Cartwright cried when they told her and became the baby's honorary grandmother on the spot. The months that followed were chaos and wonder. Sleepless nights, endless feedings, the constant, terrifying certainty that they were doing everything wrong. But they were doing it together. And slowly, as Mercy grew from a tiny red-faced newborn into a baby with her mother's determination and her father's quiet strength, the Drummond family grew into something none of them had dared to imagine. Colton, who had never held a baby in his life, learned to cradle Mercy against his chest, with hands that could break a horse and soothe a child with equal skill. He never spoke to her the way he spoke to the world. His voice, when he held Mercy, dropped to a low rumble that was almost a purr, the sound of a man discovering tenderness and awareness in the last place he expected to find it, in himself. Everett was the first one up when Mercy cried at night. He had a gift for it, some combination of warmth and patience and the humming of half-remembered songs that could calm a screaming infant in minutes. He told Rosa it was practice for when he had children of his own someday. Colton told him he would have to find someone willing to marry him first, and Everett told him that Colton should worry about the same thing, and for a moment, the cabin sounded like what it was. A home, full of people who loved each other enough to give each other grief about it. 2 years passed, then 5, then 10. The Drummond Ranch grew from a struggling homestead into one of the strongest operations in the territory. The herd topped 100 head. The loan was paid off ahead of schedule. The cabin expanded into a proper house with a real kitchen and bedrooms for everyone, and a porch that wrapped around 2 sides and looked out over a valley that got greener every year. They hired 2 young ranch hands who worked beside the brothers and who treated Rosa with the same respect they gave Silas, because everyone in Elk Ridge knew by now that the Drummond Ranch succeeded because of all 4 of them, not in spite of what they had been through, but because of it. Mercy grew. She had Rosa's blue eyes and Silas's scar, which is to say she had her mother's ability to see the truth in people and her father's ability to survive whatever the truth demanded. She learned to ride from Colton, who put her on her first horse at age 4 and watched her like a hawk and never once told her to be careful, because he believed children should learn the weight of the world by feeling it, not by being warned about it. She learned to cook from Everett, who stood her on a stool beside the stove and taught her the same things he had taught Rosa all those years ago. She learned to build from Silas, who showed her how to read the grain of wood and the set of a nail and the way a structure holds together when every joint is true. And she learned from all of them that family is not something you are born into. It is something you build with your own hands, day by day, choice by choice, until it is strong enough to hold against anything the world can throw at it. 25 years later, 1899. Silas Drummond stood on the porch of the house they had built and looked out over a ranch that covered more of the valley than he could see from any single point. The scar on his face had faded to a silver line on the sun-darkened skin. His hair was white now, but he still stood straight, still carried himself with the quiet authority of a man who had earned every inch of ground he stood on. Rosa sat beside him in the chair Everett had built for her 10th anniversary, cushioned and solid, and positioned to catch the morning sun. She was 48 years old. Silver threads wound through her honey blonde hair. Her hands were roughened by a quarter-century of mountain living, scarred in small ways by barbed wire and cast iron, and all the sharp edges of a frontier life. Her cornflower blue eyes were still bright, still seeing everything. Colton leaned against the porch rail, 56 years old and slower than he used to be. His hair had gone gray at the temples and his knees complained on cold mornings, and he could no longer break horses the way he had in his 30s. But he still carried a knife on his belt, still had the look of a man who could make a grown man reconsider his life choices with nothing more than a glance. The anger was still there somewhere deep, but Rosa had spent 25 years teaching him that he did not have to keep it loaded and ready at all times. He had learned, slowly, in his own way, but he had learned. Everett was inside cooking Sunday dinner for the whole family, humming a song to the grandchild balanced on his hip. 52 years old and still the glue. Still the warmth, still the one who made sure everyone ate and everyone laughed and no one sat alone in the dark if he could help it. Mercy had grown up and married a rancher's son from the next valley. Her children, 3 of them, now ran through the wildflowers in the yard, chasing each other with shrieks of laughter that carried across the quiet afternoon like music. The oldest worked the ranch alongside Colton, learning horses the way Mercy had learned them by doing. The youngest, barely walking, slept in the oak cradle that Colton had carved 25 years ago, sanded smooth again and oiled again for a new generation. When Colton thought no one was looking, he would stand over that cradle and run his fingers along the rim the same way he had the first time, a gesture unchanged by time, a love unchanged by years. The Drummond Ranch was one of the largest in Wyoming. When new settlers came through Elk Ridge asking about life on the frontier, about what it took to build something from nothing, in a country that offered no guarantees and no mercy, people told them about the Drummond brothers. 3 mountain men who had nearly died alone on this ridge, eaten alive by grief and guilt, and the stubborn belief that they did not deserve anything better, and the city woman who had traveled 1,000 miles to prove them wrong. Do you ever regret it? Silas asked. The evening light was fading, turning the valley gold and purple, the mountains standing dark against a sky that seemed to go on forever. Leaving Chicago, giving up everything you had. Rosa looked at him, the same look she had given him 10,000 evenings before this one, the look that said she saw him, all of him. The scar and the strength and the fear and the love, and every complicated thing he was and had been and would be for whatever time they had left. Everything I had, she said. I had nothing, Silas, a name that meant obligation, money that came with chains, a future that would have killed everything real inside me. She took his hand, the same hand that had first touched hers over a fence hammer on a cold October morning a lifetime ago. His skin was rough. Hers was rough. 25 years of the same work had made them match. This is family, she said. You and Colton and Everett and Mercy and these children and this life we built. This is real. This is mine because I chose it. Not because someone told me it should be mine. Because I chose it. Every day. For 25 years. And I would choose it again. I love you, Silas said. Simple as the first time he had said it, standing in this same cabin with soot on his hands and terror in his heart. I love you too. Every stubborn, wonderful part of you. The screen door creaked open and Colton came out, moving with the careful deliberateness of a man whose body had started making demands his pride did not want to honor. He sat on the top step, close but not too close. That was Colton's way. Always had been. Always would be. Everett followed, a kitchen towel draped over his shoulder and a coffee cup in each hand, one for Colton and one for himself. He settled on the other side of the step. The smell of fresh bread drifted through the open door, warm and yeasty and utterly familiar. The smell of Everett. The smell of home. 4 people on a porch, looking out at a valley they had built a life in, a life that had started with a stagecoach and a letter, and 3 scared men who thought they did not deserve anything good in this world, and a woman who was brave enough, stubborn enough, strong enough to prove them wrong. Somewhere inside, a grandchild laughed. Somewhere in the barn, a horse stamped and snorted in the evening cool. Somewhere up on the ridge, a hawk circled against the fading sky, riding the last warm currents of the day. This is your home, Silas said softly. The same words he had spoken 25 years ago in a cabin that smelled like pine smoke and in hope. The same words he had spoken 1,000 times since, in 1,000 different ways, until they had worn smooth with repetition like stones in a creek bed. But they still meant the same thing. They would always mean the same thing. Rosa squeezed his hand. Her blue eyes caught the last of the light and held it. This is our home, she answered, built with our own hands. And the mountain that had chosen them from the very beginning, that had tested them with fire and ice, and the cruelty of powerful men, and the slow, patient work of seasons turning one into the next. That mountain nodded its ancient agreement in the wind that moved through the pines and down the valley and across the years like a blessing that had no end and needed none.